Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brook Duer from the Penn State Law Center for Agricultural and Shale Law. As you know, this is the Agricultural Law Symposium that we're conducting in connection with the 2021 Virtual Farm Show. We're honored to be part of the Virtual Farm Show, and it gave us a chance here at the Ag Law Center to, do some educational programming that's a bit more comprehensive than some of the things we've done before, and gives us a chance to also offer some CLE credits for Pennsylvania licensed attorneys if you wish to do that. Our session today is going to run from 1 to 2, then we're going to have a 15-minute break, and then 2:15 to 3:15. Our first topic is going to be the Chesapeake Bay, and our first speaker will be Lara Fowler, who's a professor at Penn State Law. She can give you a little bit about her background at the beginning. We're really honored to have Lara with us here, and she's going to cover developments relating to the recent litigation, a little bit of background, of course, to bring you up to date on the Chesapeake Bay circumstances, and particularly the legal circumstances with regard to the TMDLs and the targets for 2015, and then talk about the most recent litigation that was filed against the EPA by a number of states, essentially highlighting that the EPA is not forcing Pennsylvania to comply in such a way that the targets for 2015 could be met. Paul Goeringer is going to also talk about the Bay, but in a little bit different context. He's going to talk about the Conowingo Dam licensing, and then there's some litigation relating to the licensing, and then there's a settlement of that litigation relating to the licensing. And then Lara is also going to discuss, after we reach that point, she's going to discuss the Conowingo WIP, Watershed Improvement Plan, and that may be news to a lot of us here in Pennsylvania, relatively recent development. Now, this afternoon session will be two of our staff at the Ag Law Center, Jackie Schweickler and Chloe Marie. And Jackie is going to be talking about pesticide and particularly civil liability in connection with pesticide drift, or I like to say, and sort of have picked up from the pesticide people, the term non-target injury. And then Chloe will be talking about much of the litigation and registration approvals from the EPA that have gone on in the last, more than the last year, really. But of course, we had the big drama over the dicamba registration cancellations and then new registrations issued. So that will be covered in the second hour. If you want to get CLE credits for these hours, there are separate CLE credit forms for each hour. We went over this in the first session on Tuesday, but we will provide you with links to the separate CLE forms to fill out, one for each hour. In connection with that, we have to do a little compliance check. So we will be including code words, and there'll be 2 words that are given during the first hour, which you will then write on your CLE compliance attendance form for that hour. And Lara Fowler will give out those words. And then in the second hour, again, there will be 2 different code words given out at different times, which you will need to hang on to and record and put on your compliance form. Lastly, and then we'll get started, if in fact there are anybody who is, or there is anyone who is attending the second hour for the purpose of receiving pesticide applicator recertification credits, which are our second hour is eligible to receive 1 hour of recertification credits, and we did publicize earlier the various categories. Then Jackie Schweickler will give you some instructions on how to fill out or what to do in order to gain those credits. You need to send certain information to her. So if there's any more questions, we have a website that has all this information. Sorry, I couldn't have it on slides. I had some slides ready and there was some sort of malfunction. Okay, without further, and by the way, this webinar is being recorded. So we just need to make sure that you understand that. There will be various communications in the chat function for all attendees. If you have questions that you want the panelists to address, please put those in the Q&A, not the chat, in the Q&A at any time, and then we will try to make sure there's enough time at the end of each session to answer any questions that may arise. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, which is Professor Lara Fowler from the Penn State Law School. Turn it over to you, Lara.
Great, thanks, Brooke. And just checking that you can see my full screen here.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the chance to talk with everybody today. And talk is entitled Chesapeake Bay Developments, Moving the Ball or the Goal Line. And I'll walk you through why as we get through that talk. As Brooke said, I actually wear many different hats, both teach at Penn State Law, but I also work across the university with our Penn State Institutes of Energy and Environment. Also affiliate faculty with Penn State School of International Affairs. And on the international side, I actually spent much of this past year in Sweden looking deeply into the Baltic issues. And I will tell you that Chesapeake and Baltic issues, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of overlap. And of interest for this group, I'm also on the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, serving in the executive committee, but also a normal member for that. So involved one way or another in quite a few aspects of these issues. So I'm going to go pretty quickly in giving a little bit of background, in part because we have an audience that I want to make sure everybody's coming up to speed. This for me is always an interesting picture. Looking down at the Chesapeake Bay itself, people say that if you take a piece of paper, the Chesapeake Bay is as wide as a piece of paper is and as deep in comparison. But usually the bay is shown something like this, where it's really cuts off actually the northern watershed coming into the bay, and we'll talk about why that matters. There's been a lot of work over a lot of time, a lot of projects about ecosystem restoration and what that looks like. If you look at a different picture again of the bay, you see just how much of the watershed comes from the Susquehanna River in particular, which is 50% or more of the inflow flowing from New York, Pennsylvania, and on into the bay, compared to the rest of the watershed. So useful to keep both pictures in mind as we walk through. The law and policy has really evolved. Again, this is a very quick snapshot, starting with the 1972 Clean Water Act. There was originally a 1979 deadline to clean up impaired waters across the United States and including in the Chesapeake Bay. The first Bay Agreement was signed in 1983 between Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and DC, was revised to reduce nitrogen inputs by 40%. 1999, there was a lawsuit by the American Canoe Association basically saying, look, you're not moving along fast enough to meet what you have agreed to do. In the year 2000, there was a different Chesapeake Bay agreement, 40% reduction of trying to get streams off the impaired waters list by 2010. 2007, an Inspector General report came along and said, you're still not getting there. In 2010, President Obama issued an executive order creating in part the total maximum daily load, the TMDL, and requiring periodic watershed implementation plans or WIPs. 2014, there was another agreement, the watershed agreement that not only looked at the TMDL and water quality questions, but broadened it, for example, to living resources in other areas. This slide, I'm going to take each piece of this and give you a little bit more detail. So here's the big picture, and then I'm going to drill into each of these. 2015, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a challenge by the American Farm Bureau, basically saying, yes, TMDL is lawful. And again, I'll get into that more. 2017, there was a midpoint assessment. How are we doing? 2019, each of the states and Washington, D.C. were supposed to submit updated phase 3 watershed implementation plans. Those had been reviewed, and again, I'll get into more detail. In 2020, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and other states actually filed a notice of intent to sue. These were then filed late in 2020. 2025, again, this is all just big picture, and I'll drill into this. There's a deadline for the practices to be in place. And that's actually really important language because it's not requirement that actually the nutrient reductions are met. It's more that the practices need to be in place to be moving us towards those nutrients. And that's one of those places where the goalposts are a little bit hard to figure out. I mentioned already the total maximum daily load passed in 2010. It's a fairly long and detailed document. Basically says this is legal requirements to reduce the nutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, total dissolved solids, sediment, dirt, so that we can achieve the standards for dissolved oxygen, water clarity, and chlorophyll A, and help meet these living resources goals. Basically, and the way I liken it, if I'm talking to somebody who's not regularly involved with the Chesapeake Bay, think about giving a kid way too much sugar. They eat it very quickly, they may run around and then they collapse. Well, if you give algae too much sugar in the way of nitrogen or phosphorus, they will grow very quickly, and as they collapse and die, they start to break down, and that leads to some of the eutrophication and the lack or the impact of the dissolved oxygen in the actual Chesapeake Bay. It impacts water quality and it impacts the chlorophyll A, reducing the ability of living resources, fish and other critters, to actually live. So set specific limits codified in the TMDL for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. These have been revised more recently. Overall, this references, again, 25% reduction in nitrogen, 24% phosphorus, and 20% in sediment. The TMDL is designed to ensure, this is again that language that's really important, it doesn't say we will meet all of these reductions, but we are designed to ensure that all the pollution control measures, the best management practices, are fully in place by 2025 with at least 60% by 2017, that midpoint assessment. Implementation, I've already mentioned the watershed implementation plans are the responsibility of the 6 Bay states, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, DC. The first phase 1 WIP, there was an expectation letter, what are we looking for, sent out in 2009, submission in 2010. You can see the dates here. A little bit of a lag between phase 2 and phase 3. Again, this key requirement are what are you as a state or a Commonwealth for Pennsylvania actually going to do to reduce your sediment and phosphorus and nitrogen loads to meet these targets? In 2010, the American Farm Bureau filed a lawsuit basically saying, hey, this is unlawful. You can't do this. 2013, there was a 99-page decision by Justice Rambo in the U.S. District Court for Central Pennsylvania upholding it. So it was appealed to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals and upheld and denied cert by the U.S. Supreme Court. Key findings, yes, this is actual lawful federalism between the states and the U.S. government under the Clean Water Act, in part because of the consultation and engagement. There was plenty of public notice and comment, and the use of, by the Environmental Protection Agency, both of modeling and data was appropriate. Hold this case in mind because it matters now for how things are playing out on the legal side. 2014, I mentioned this before, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement not only dealt with water quality, but a number of different issues. It set out key goals and then a number of implementation things to think about. What kind of outcomes are we really looking for? So elsewhere in the plan, for example, thinking about living resources, there's an outcome, for example, for black ducks. How many black ducks do we have? What do we do to achieve wetlands? All things that will help support restoration of the Chesapeake Bay. 2017, that key point of saying, well, where are we? What's the midpoint assessment? Certainly found progress, but also the need for more action. We have seen record acreage for underwater grasses, submerged aquatic vegetation or SAV, and the highest estimates of water quality standards attained in the last 30 years. However, it also said while we're at 60% of meeting our goals for reducing both phosphorus and sediment under the current suite of modeling tools, emphasis on modeling right now for a second, I'll come back to modeling and monitoring the difference between, but the goal for meeting nitrogen was not yet met. People also started looking and saying, well, where are we? We have used the various suite of models to calculate what we think the load reduction should be for nitrogen, phosphorus, and total dissolved solid. But we are going out and we're seeing through our monitoring stations less than we thought. So this is a map that shows all sources of total phosphorus, delivered phosphorus to the bay. You do see some areas, particularly down here in southeastern Pennsylvania, Lancaster County being kind of a central piece of that, but other areas, the Delmarva Peninsula, for example, or the Shenandoah Valley, with a high amount of phosphorus coming through that. People in looking at this, and this is a complicated map, a lot of you who are on the phone have seen this before, but let me walk you through. If there's a dot, there is no trend. If it's a downward arrow, there is an improving trend. An increasing or an upward arrow is a degrading or things are getting worse trend. Average load, blue is not so much, yellow, a medium, and red, not so good. So what you see, for example, is a downward or an improving trend, for example, in the upper Susquehanna River area. Try and give you an arrow, but down at the lower Susquehanna in particular, an increasing trend of pretty heavy amount of loads. but we'll come back to that, particularly when it relates to the Conowingo Dam and the lower Susquehanna. If you look at it also for nitrogen, you see a similar type map, again, with that heavy load coming from southeastern Pennsylvania in particular. And the same type of map showing improving trends in a lot of areas, but still heavy loads in some key hotspots. A lot of questions. I mentioned the Conowingo Dam are coming out with sediment from the dam, and Paul in particular is going to talk about why the Conowingo Dam is so important. So I'm going to gloss past this very quickly. But this is a really, really big issue, and this is something that has evolved since the 2010 TMDL was created. So I'll leave that, and just as a teaser for his talk. Keep going here. Mentioned already, the Susquehanna River provides more than 50% of the freshwater inflow into the bay, making what happens in New York and particularly Pennsylvania really of critical interest. A little bit closer look of the Bay watershed in Pennsylvania. We also have a piece of the Potomac River Basin down in our south central portion. The impact of upstream flows, again, really puts the focus on Pennsylvania. This is headlines from 2015 prior to the midpoint assessments. EPA was already looking at what was happening in Pennsylvania and saying, well, we're a little bit worried about what's happening here. We are seeing more pollution than we expect flow into the bay. We don't really understand why. At that point, a lot of research was going into why, and again, part of it's coming from the Conowingo, and part of it's just looking at what did we expect would happen through the modeling versus what are we seeing happening in the monitoring. The midpoint assessment, this was a graph that people will call the stoplight chart for obvious reasons, but this was released as part of the midpoint assessment or after it in 2018, basically saying, where are we? The green is that there's ongoing oversight by the Environmental Protection Agency. The yellow is that there's enhanced oversight, and the red is saying Environmental Protection Agency basically being, we may need to put you under backstop authority because you're not coming along fast enough. You see that for Pennsylvania for agriculture and urban and suburban, mainly from stormwater runoff type questions. You also have enhanced oversight for New York for the wastewater treatment plants, as well as a couple other areas in other states. Pennsylvania has made and so I'm going to focus for a little bit on both Pennsylvania and New York. Pennsylvania has very much changed its approach between the phase 2 and phase 3 watershed implementation plans. The phase 2 plan more or less said this is top down, it's created by the Commonwealth, the counties, and then the regions. Several years ago, I was here in Center County and I was talking with folks who were very deeply involved with watershed restoration, and they were like, yeah, we've never read the phase 2 watershed implementation plan. That document has no relevance for what we're doing. In contrast, the phase 3 approach for Pennsylvania has been very much bottom up, stakeholder engagement, a lot of work groups for pilot counties, and then county by county implementation. And I'm hearing already tons and tons of engagement by a whole bunch of people at the county level now in Pennsylvania, and I'll cover that a little bit more in a second. 2019, each of the jurisdictions submitted their phase 3 watershed implementation plans and received feedback in 2019 from the Environmental Protection Agency. EPA basically said, look, if Virginia and Maryland plans, if fully funded and implemented, they're going to meet their targets. That's a big if. It is made much, much harder by the time of COVID and the impact that that has had on local jurisdictions' budgets. Pennsylvania's plan as written was underfunded by 250 to 300 million and 25% short of meeting its nitrogen reduction goal. And New York's plan did not, as written, meet its nitrogen reduction goals. Again, Pennsylvania, a closer review of this basically said we're not meeting these nitrogen plans, and it doesn't explain how or when additional reductions from the remaining county action plans will be incorporated into the broader plan to achieve the nitrogen planning target. Basically, look, you've told us, you know, EPA said you have to meet this target. You're about 25% short of that, and you don't have the funding to get there. How are you going to achieve that gap? About a year ago, I was actually in Sweden and I heard about this meeting very quickly. Dana Angst, who is the director of the Chesapeake Bay program, in a meeting basically said, I don't think that the Bay TMDL, total maximum daily load, is actually enforceable. That might be the quote heard around the world. It's an aspirational and not an enforceable deadline. Because a lot of people are like, well, we're spending a ton of money and a ton of effort to do this. And if this is not enforceable, why are we doing this? In early 2020, Virginia and Maryland and other states actually, and a number of different parties, so there were two 60-day notices of intent to sue under the Clean Water Act. That's a jurisdictional requirement that you send that kind of notice saying we are going to sue you under the Clean Water Act. It cannot be less than 60 days. But they basically said, look, you have failed to ensure that the Bay jurisdictions will actually meet these reduction commitments by the 2025 deadline. And this is a violation of the Clean Water Act, the Administrative Procedures Act, and the 2014 Bay Agreement. These were filed, actual lawsuits were filed in 2010 in the DC District Court. These are pending. So this is from the Chesapeake Bay Journal. You can see this basically saying, look, Pennsylvania and New York need to be doing more to actually clean up the Bay. And if you don't, EPA, you are shirking your responsibility under the Clean Water Act. I went and looked at the docket and updated this. This is as of this morning. These cases have now been consolidated. Again, two sets of cases, one by the states in DC, one by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So just a set of activities, September 2020, the cases were filed. October was really attorneys filing their notices of appearance. In November, New York State actually had an uncontested motion to intervene, so they are now a party to the case. Also in November, the Environmental Protection Agency actually submitted a motion to extend time to file its administrative record, as well as asking for a motion to dismiss, saying there's no jurisdiction and there's a failure to state a claim. Originally, the plaintiff's response to the motion to dismiss was due in January, basically 2 days ago. The cases were then consolidated later in November and December. The schedule was updated. So the motion to extend the deadline to file a whole bunch of documents was granted. All of those documents are now due by the end of February. And the plaintiff's responses to the motion to dismiss is now due in April, with a reply from EPA due in May, and any final reply from the plaintiffs due in June. Again, these cases are consolidated into one, and this is the briefing schedule as it stands as of this morning. In the meantime, let me go back to New York. New York actually amended its Phase 3 Watershed Implementation Plan in November of 2020, right after these lawsuits were filed. Environmental Protection Agency has reviewed and provided its evaluation as of a week ago. Their amendments, basically building on their existing Phase 3 Watershed Implementation Plan, proposed additional reductions in agriculture based on a lot of coordination with a whole bunch of different entities, agriculturally related. And they updated their wastewater projections in 2025 loads delivered to the Bay. They also listed upgrades already underway for wastewater treatment plants that would significantly help with their nitrogen reduction. Environmental Protection Agency took a look at this and said, look, you've got some great areas of strength. We appreciate your new projections for the wastewater treatment plants, including some trades of phosphorus reductions to nitrogen to better address their nitrogen needs. They also had listed a number of increased fundings, tax credits, and emphasized coordination, while providing a strong framework for communication and outreach. EPA also recognized the need for actual annual tracking and BMP implementation, as well as asking for more detail on their stormwater implementation and changes to the wastewater treatment plants. Basically, show us what you are actually doing as you go through. So that leaves things kind of where they are. I mean, this is, again, news of about a week ago for New York. I have talked with folks who in the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, I think I asked them in November, October and November where they stood, and they were basically like, we are very, very focused on meeting our county-wide action plans for implementing this for the Chesapeake Bay. Pennsylvania has not filed to intervene in this set of lawsuits. So the lawsuits are kind of pending. In the meantime, that leaves environmental protection agencies looking at potential mechanisms for enforcement. What's the backstop authority here? Can they target federal enforcement or compliance in particular watersheds? Can they direct funding to identify priorities? Can they establish loads for Pennsylvania, for example, through a state-specific amendment to the TMDL that really focuses on Pennsylvania? And they require reductions in loading for point sources through a Pennsylvania state proposed amendment. And could they change water quality standards within the Bay? Some of this stuff has been tried prior to now. For example, in 2010, you had a lot of enforcement from the Environmental Protection Agency on Amish farmers in southern Pennsylvania. This led to a lot of backlash of saying, is this religious persecution? What does that look like? They have also actually tried withholding funding from Pennsylvania in 2016. Pennsylvania then did a reboot strategy to basically say, no, we're really going to enforce this, at which point the federal funding was released. So yes, there are enforcement mechanisms. The list here of the 5 enforcement mechanisms were from EPA's expectations for Pennsylvania, saying this is what we could do. What might happen? Again, big questions. Let me pause there for a second and switch gears. There's another case that's actually pending. It was filed against the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality by the Virginia Association of Municipal Wastewater Associates. Chesapeake Bay Foundation has now intervened. The basic case is them saying, look, the whole Virginia's phase 3 WIP should be invalidated. And we want you to take out the provisions associated with the wastewater treatment plants, requiring us to upgrade our facilities. This is pending. I didn't have a chance to go look at the docket to see where this stands, but this, if this goes through, is also a very big case. So very quickly, while all of this is a big set of challenges, it's also an opportunity. If you think about the non-point source water coming from a number of diffuse sources, how do we really address that? And a lot of that is people, it's behavior change, but it's also really looking at agricultural practices. It's looking at stormwater management from cities and communities. To back up a little bit further and just look at this from a state perspective, a Commonwealth's perspective, Pennsylvania has the most number of impaired streams or stream segments of anywhere in the United States. Number of sources of impairment: agriculture, abandoned mine drainage, I haven't talked about, but really critical, stormwater runoff, and a little bit from point sources. A number of you who are on this call actually participated in the 2016 Pennsylvania in the Balance Conference, where we brought about 100 people together to talk about, could we find a way to ensure healthy and productive agriculture and meet water quality goals? Soil health was a really big focus, but also people's ability to actually talk with each other. I love this quote, this feels like we can all try to pull together to make things better for the watershed in the Bay. It's a real lonely feeling that ag is in this alone and to blame for what has happened. A number of people said, look, we don't want to have a target on our back. We want to be part of the solution. What can we do? A lot of discussions came out of this. This is a picture of everybody on the steps and a report that says, how do we help move this forward? How do we harness agricultural's culture of stewardship as a solution to Pennsylvania's clean water? And I think a lot of that actually helped, I hope helped lead to some of the backdrop of how Pennsylvania has been approaching this. Really thinking about, and I love this logo, right? Clean water. What do we do that's great for Pennsylvania and it's good for the Bay? So that's, I think, the switch that you see from the phase 2 to the phase 3 watershed implementation for Pennsylvania. How do you convene by counties, because that's the jurisdiction that has power, identify local priorities and initiatives, think about local resources, select and report actions, and then figure out how to implement and continue reporting it. So I mentioned that there were 4 pilot counties. Those have already moved forward with creating their own county action plans. Let's see if I can do it from memory. Lancaster, York, Franklin, and Adams County. And the rest of the counties are moving forward with that. We're in Center County in the middle and well underway. So what are the potential local priorities, and are there co-benefits of doing this? Can we get clean drinking water? How do we help farms with food and beverage production? What's public health? Decreasing erosion, increasing outdoor recreation, particularly right now when people are avidly interested in it, thinking about income from recreation and tourism, and habitat for a whole manner of different things. So it's kind of flipping it again and thinking about, well, what do we need to do for Pennsylvania that also benefits the Bay? I mentioned the tiered approach. Where should watersheds be prioritized? And this is a picture of those priorities. The tier 1's going first down to tier 4. The last 25% of reductions and where we might need them to come from. Pennsylvania, I mentioned this already, is very focused on watershed implementation through this, basically saying, look, we have achieved what we think is possible to get there. A number of meetings, different work groups. You can see sort of the time frame for all of this is more than I want to get into. But what's happening right now is those other counties are really starting to develop their climate action plans. And again, you're starting to hear lots of discussion even here in Center County of what do we need to do? How do we do this? Challenges going forward: watershed non-point source runoff. big issue all the way around. Conowingo Dam, we'll talk more about that. Land use changes, right? The more impervious surface you put, the more stormwater runoff you get. And then the question of COVID-19 and environmental justice. How did these play out? Mentioned COVID. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Well, two things I want to mention just very quickly. Pennsylvania is currently doing watershed planning across the state. And the Susquehanna River Basin Commission is also working on a comprehensive plan update with comments due, I think, in January of this year. So there's a bunch of things happening behind the scenes, not necessarily related with the Chesapeake Bay issues either. I'm going to skip over this. We are working on a project really looking at how do we use local engagement. We have a couple pilot sites here, the Water for Ag project, and I'm happy to answer questions about that later. There is a real need to engage locally. I actually took a number of students, law students and grad students out to work in the Spring Creek buffer this fall, and people were really happy to think about it. There's also a discussion, Ann Swanson, who's the head of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, kind of the political body overseeing pieces of this. And they have submitted a proposal for a new civilian conservation corps, right? It takes bodies to get out and do some of this work, but it's also an opportunity for engagement. The students I had out with me this fall had a fantastic time pulling grapevine and talking water. But thinking about how do we integrate all of these, thinking about the financing, which I'll come back to with the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan, and how do we kind of scale up what might be needed to get these activities done on the ground. I'm going to go back to the Conowingo Dam. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn this over to Paul, and then he'll give his spiel, and I will then pick it up from there on what's happening with the Watershed Implementation Plan.
Okay.
Paul, go for it. Sorry, that was a very quick review, but
That was, you did a nice job of getting us in it. We're at 1:31 and we covered what we needed to. Thank you. Go ahead, Paul.
Let me get mine up. Okay. So thank you. Thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Conowingo Dam issues that kind of do exist, that are ongoing.
Paul, I noticed that I did not give much of an introduction for you in terms of where you work and what you do. Do that.
So I can do that. I'm Paul Goeringer. I'm with the University of Maryland. I'm a senior faculty specialist and the extension legal specialist in our Department of Ag and Resource Economics in the College of Ag. I also work with the Ag Law Education Initiative, which is sort of the Maryland version of what Ross, Brooke, Jackie, and Chloe Center. We're funded by Empowering State. I'll skip all that. So let's talk a little bit about the Conowingo Dam. It was a dam that was built in 1928. It started out as a hydroelectric dam. It still is a hydroelectric dam. It's located on the lower Susquehanna River, and it's located within 10 miles of the bay. So since 1928, it has basically acted as this large sediment trap and nutrient trap that has played a role in the bay's health, and now it's playing potentially a different role as we look at what it hits. When the TMDL for the bay was originally put together and some of the studies were done, it was viewed that the Conowingo would still act as this trap until at least 2025. Issues developed, and I've got some pictures here in a minute, or at least one picture, that show that by 2014, it was found that basically the dam was no longer acting as that sediment trap. It no longer had storage capacity. Basically, it's at equilibrium. If any large weather event happens, it causes sediment, nutrients to spill out into the bay. So here in a second, I'll show Tropical Storm Lee, the impacts of it. I looked for Hurricane Sandy, but couldn't find any exact images of Hurricane Sandy with a plume of sediment that comes out into the bay from the Susquehanna once it hits the Conowingo Dam. And those issues that do exist because of that. So here's one example of that. So if we look at the plume right here, you can see it's going into the bay coming from the Conowingo Dam. So this is one example whenever we have large rain events, either Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, that hit it, it does end up causing issues with nutrients hitting the bay and causing a number of concerns towards the bay's health. The dam is currently owned by Exelon Corp. and the current license expired in 2014. They have to go through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to do this. They began the renewal process in 2014 when they began, or they are currently seeking a 50-year license, and it's currently, we'll talk about the process that they've been going through, but it's currently before the FERC looking at this. When they began, they had to do a bunch of environmental studies that took some time, and they've been working on it. And since the license has expired, they're on a year-to-year, just FERC reissues one-year rolling licenses as it goes along. So part of the first process in getting this dam relicensed is we have to go through what's known as the Section 404 process. And this is related to the Clean Water Act. It's Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. It requires any discharge into a covered water gets a 404 permit. This is done through the state of Maryland. They have to provide some sort of water quality certification to FERC for the dam. So with this process, the state goes through a one-year process to either deny, waive, or grant or certify these conditions. Whatever conditions they come up with related to water quality will be then issued into the permit. I have that here in a second. And normally with my PowerPoints, I would put in like weird pictures just to keep you entertained and make you pay attention. But I went through the Chesapeake Bay program and they had such great pictures from the Conowingo. I just used those for this presentation to at least show what it is. That's pretty rare for some of the stuff I end up having to talk about. So if we look at this, any of these conditions that they come up with, like I said before, will be incorporated into whatever permit FERC issues them in the end. So all of this is a part of it. And if we look at this, this is a 50-year license from the state of Maryland standpoint. This is the only time they get an opportunity to put any conditions on water quality on this dam and any of the restrictions they need to put in. So they took that into consideration as well. And that's a lot of what the state has looked at as they've done this process. So in this conditions, and we'll talk about how we got to these conditions here in a minute. The state had looked at, the dissolved oxygen in the bay and wanted limitations put on it coming from the dam, impacts on aquatic life and migratory fish. If we look at it, there are flows that are open so fish can go through it. I can't remember all the fish that have to go upstream through the Susquehanna as a part of a normal cycle. There's fish passages, there's fish lifts, there's also removal of trash and debris that's a part of this, and also lessening of impact on aquatic habitats as it enters the bay and some of the nutrient loads that it hit and cause damage to some of those issues.
Well,
yes.
Break, we will give out our first code word for CLE compliance. The word is water. So that's your first code word to put on your attendance sheet, water. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So after going through the environmental impact portion, Exelon made their first request to the state of Maryland in 2014. This was sort of withdrawn and then resubmitted a few times. And the state of Maryland finally issued the final water quality conditions in April of 2018. Almost immediately, legal challenges were filed, and the Court of Special Appeals for the state of Maryland, or the Intermediate Appellate Court, issued or basically ordered the state and Exelon into mediation, and they reached a settlement in October of 2019. So as a part of this settlement process, the water quality standards that the state had developed were kind of reconfigured to fit within that, but those were more or less similar to what was adopted. And then Exelon agreed to pay annually for water quality projects. Basically, they will pay over $200 million over 50 years. This is not all just cash. It's also other improvements they will be making over time as a part of this process. So once that settlement was finalized, that moved the process forward with FERC. So now they can move forward with FERC to get a new license. And the last point I want to make on the 404 process is if it's not fully accepted by FERC into the final permit, the state and Exelon can always go back and renegotiate the agreement, or they can just walk away and begin the process all over again. There's some issues as to whether or not it will be fully approved by FERC. So FERC began that process pretty much in late October 2019, once they got the settlement between Exelon and the state. They worked on it and then sent out for public comment in early 2020 the what would be the final permit. As a part of that process, a number of environmental groups are now opposed to the relicensing because of the settlement agreement. They do not believe in some cases that the cash payments are enough to actually provide impacts on any of the water quality issues that they want addressed. Consistently, we're still not sure how FERC will handle this. I believe FERC just within the past, and Laura may be able to answer this better, within the past couple of weeks or past couple of months has finally gotten full quorum, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so they have not even had a full board that could actually look at this thing until within the past 2 or 3 months. So it will hopefully be moving forward, and we'll actually be getting a sense of what will be happening with this sort of settlement process and this reissuing of the license. Looking at the licensing options that FERC has as they go through this process, the statute only gives them 2 options. They can either take over the project and maintain it and operate it. They have to pay the licensee the net investment not to exceed fair market value of the property plus reasonable expenses. They have not exercised that option here. Then I say there are 2 options, but under option 2, there are sort of 2 paths they can take. They can then either re-license the project to the existing licensee upon such terms and conditions required by existing laws and regulations, or they can issue it to a new licensee under the same terms and conditions. So as I said, we're kind of in a wait and see approach with all of this. We don't exactly know where FERC is going to go at this point, just because they've just gotten a full quorum and they're able to move stuff forward. So we're actually waiting to see how the terms and conditions that the state has negotiated within the water quality standards will be finally approved, and then what other terms and conditions will be placed upon operating the dam moving forward, to see even if Exelon will accept those or if they'll start the process over or look for somebody to take the dam over. And I believe that's all I have, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Paul, before you go, let me just ask you to review one thing again.
Yes.
The cash payments that were the settlement between Exelon and Maryland, what were those to be used for again?
They're to be used for water quality projects related to the dam, and then some improvements to habitat, and then other things. It works out, I can't remember the exact dollar amount, but it's about 20 million a year, I believe.
Okay, and those were to be things done on the Maryland side of the state line in any of that, any of the watershed that is on the Maryland side of the state line, correct?
Yes, any of the Maryland side, and then I think portions of the bay where the Susquehanna would hit.
Yeah, okay, all right. Sorry, Laura, go ahead.
Great. And I was just putting in the chat, FERC was lacking a quorum actually until 2017. They just haven't had enough members. So the combination of they couldn't make any decisions for a while, followed by they were lacking people, has meant that they've been insanely slow in making.
Oh, you muted yourself.
Muted myself instead of hitting enter, so I'll put that in the chat function. Let me go back and share my screen and come back to the Conowingo here. So where are we with the Conowingo? I mentioned that there's these watershed implementation plans for each of the states, which is fine. But then there was this realization, as Paul noted, that how do we actually handle it in terms of the Conowingo, right? If this area is now dynamically full and you have this huge amount of nitrogen and phosphorus coming into the Susquehanna, and that's one of our hotspots, what do we do about that? Can we dredge it? Can we take this out? Huge amount of work looking at dredging it. Enter into the FERC licensing stuff. I'm sure Exelon thinks, why in the world are we in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay and dealing with this question? Can we get out of it? But there was a political decision made following the midpoint assessment, basically to create and carve out the Conowingo Dam as its own, I jokingly call it the state of Conowingo. You never knew that there was actually this 51st state, but it's its own watershed implementation plan. And I will emphasize this, there is an open watershed implementation plan. Comments are due by January 21st, 2021, next week. So there's a steering committee that has worked at this. They actually hired an outside consultant to come through and create a watershed implementation plan. They call it the CWIP. It was released in October. There was a tremendous amount of public outreach and engagement. All of that information is available on the Conowingo WIP steering committee's page. They basically were really focused on how do we handle nitrogen? What are the nitrogen reductions we can get out of this? But they're also looking at and focused on what's the multi-jurisdictional cooperative approach to think about locations for implementation. At the end of the day, if you are going to decrease nitrogen flowing through the Susquehanna River and out into the bay, you have to implement practices somewhere. That would be probably upstream in Pennsylvania and New York, which of course are working on their own watershed implementation plans. It also lays out a financing strategy, including meeting goals for co-benefits. What are those broader goals? And then it basically says we should also continue either implementing or exploring a number of other things already underway. Market mechanisms like nutrient trading, using in-water practices like dredging or ecosystem restoration, and implementing other cost-effective BMPs. If you go look at the Watershed Implementation Plan page, you will see actually a pretty robust report on financing. There is a proposal to effectively create a Conowingo financing authority, right? And so it's well worth looking at that document. I don't have time to go into all of those details, but how this is going to be implemented, how this fits and plays with the other watershed implementation plans for the states, lots of big questions. The next meeting for the steering committee is February 24th from 12 to 1 p.m. I'm sure will be an interesting meeting and anybody can tune in and listen to that. So where are we? We're in a lot of stay tuned. There's a lot of things happening, a lot of moving pieces underway. They're not all necessarily coordinated. If this seems like a very complicated and challenging mix, it is. You also had the Chesapeake Bay Foundation just recently release a report that basically says, you know, we're going to give the Bay a D-, right? We're making progress, but it's not fast enough. Same time, the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee is trying to say, hey, modeling wise, we thought we would be here. Monitoring wise, we're here. Why the difference? What can we say about that? So that review process is underway. It's been lots of hours of discussion. I mentioned COVID earlier. You know, how do we handle the fact that this is very much impacting resources, money, bandwidth, ability to get people out on the ground. So part of Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, we've actually been doing a survey. How has COVID impacted this? What is it doing to your work? And we're working on exploring some of those issues. So there's a whole tangle of a lot of different things that are happening all at once. I'm going to give you your second code word, which is perhaps appropriately sediment related to the Conowingo here. And then we're going to turn to that and, for any questions and discussions. I have my name here, but I'm going to stop share. And I think any or all of us are happy to take whatever questions you guys might have.
Okay, that's great, Laura. This is wonderful. We don't have any questions that I see yet, but I will go back and just draw out a couple of things here. Let's go back. This is kind of rudimentary stuff, but it might be helpful to go over a little bit for people that hear a lot of names of organizations and doesn't know who's who. So the Chesapeake Bay program, define for us what the program is, you know, and who is it made and who really is staffing it and, you know, doing the work.
Sure. Yeah, and so we moved here in 2012 from the Pacific Northwest, and my boss and colleague with the Institutes of Energy and Environment said, I want you to go engage with Chesapeake Bay stuff and go figure it out. And it took me probably 3 years of trying to parse through acronyms and moving pieces to just kind of get a handle. So if you feel like it's complicated, it is. The Environmental Protection Agency is the authority and the responsibility under the Clean Water Act to implement that. The Chesapeake Bay Program Office are the day-to-day staff people who help move this forward. And there's a whole bunch of staff people working on a whole number of different aspects of it. They report to a management, principal staff committee, reports to a management board. And overall, arching that, if you will, the ultimate leadership is the executive committee, which is made up of the governors and the governors of those 6 states and the mayor of Washington, D.C. And so again, it's sort of this nested enterprise. STAC, which I mentioned, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, is people like me and others at different universities who work on the research side. And it serves as kind of an independent research board working with and interrelated with that, but separate. There's a Citizens Advisory Committee. There's also a Local Government Advisory Committee that serves similar roles.
Okay.
I mentioned the 2014 agreement. There's goal implementation teams. So each of those goals has a team of people working on trying to implement that. And that's often made up of people from the different states, as well as the different agencies who are involved with it. So I can pull up a graphic, but yeah, it's a complicated ecosystem of different parties.
And then why don't you help us define for us the Chesapeake Bay Commission, separate
Sure.
from those entities for the program?
Yeah, the Chesapeake Bay Commission has actually been around for 40 years. They just celebrated their 40th anniversary with a webinar in December, I think. And it was created actually between 3 states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland, again, made up of elected officials of those states to really try and help move this forward. So it's effectively an independent body, but helps kind of coordinate, if you will, on the political side. They've identified over the years a number of really important topics, and they've been helpful in, for example, identifying and moving forward legislation in any given state. So an example, a couple years ago, they basically said, look, we in, I think it was Maryland, was being asked to adopt a rule and a standard, a policy associated with plastics and microplastics. They looked at that and said, we don't actually know what the definition of microplastics is. They came to STAC, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, and said, tell us what the research in the biophysical side of microplastics is. We will then take that back and figure out if we can make recommendations for how you approach laws and policies associated with microplastics. So one way you see some of that interaction.
And then you talked about the Chesapeake, or excuse me, the Conowingo WIP Advisory Committee, or a steering committee, excuse me, the Chesapeake WIP Steering Committee. That's a sub-entity of the program, correct? That are an appointed group that the Chesapeake Bay program, i.e. EPA, composed in order to be the proponent of this, as you said, the 51st state of Conowingo, sort of be the proponent of the WIP. Is that, am I saying that in a way that is basically correct, or?
Yes. Yeah. And so what EPA did, I mean, they basically said, look, we are at the end of the day, the ones evaluating this. So we want to create the steering committee. We want to hire an outside consultant. You guys go create this. We're going to be the reviewers. So that's the plan that's out there right now for public review. Again, really, really important. And it may be the document that you didn't know you needed to read, but if you care about the Chesapeake, please go look at this. And if you feel strongly about it one way or another, please comment. Your time period to do that is now.
And this will result in a WIP or a report with regard to an options for a WIP, I guess, what would be the next step after that? Since there is no 51st state of Conowingo, who would be responsible for implementing this WIP should it come to be?
Well, and that's where I think that their proposal for the Conowingo Financing Authority, and that would take some work to develop that. And again, there's also a report on the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan's steering committee page to that finance document. It was released in December, so that'd be my other document that I'd recommend reading, because that's the nuts and bolts of how they're proposing to actually move forward with this, is to create, and how that faces with what Paul covered with the money from Conowingo and the Exelon settlement.
Right.
I can't trace all of these pieces. There may be other people smarter than me who understand how all this flows, but it's a complicated set of dynamics that are playing out in very, very real time.
That was going to be my next question then. That's why I asked Paul the question about what was the money for. And now, is it, is the steering committee assuming that the money from the dam settlement, should the license get issued and that money actually materialize, that is assumed to already be committed to the WIP, to the Conowingo WIP? Or is that not really connected like that? Or does no one know yet?
I wasn't able to figure that out as I look. I'm like you, I tried to track the money and couldn't figure out how it flows into certain stuff. And
Yeah, I guess the answer, I thought the answer might be nobody knows yet, really. Okay, how about this, Paul, or
Okay.
Laura, if you know, I always come back to dredging. Why has there been discussion in Maryland as to why the dam settlement did not include X billion dollars for dredging?
my understanding is,
They made it, and they've made all the money off of it all these years.
yeah, my understanding is dredging is not an approved practice currently, and they have some pilot programs out to figure out if they actually can dredge the Conowingo to pull out all this settlement. But my understanding is currently under what they could do, they couldn't dredge. And from some letters I've seen, they are still actively pursuing with EPA pilot projects to figure out if they can dredge the dam, how would they do it, and then, you know, what would the costs be in the end.
And are the objecting environmental groups, you know, who have objected to the license settlement, are they raising that as one of the grounds that they've overlooked, you know, something that should have been accounted for here, or no, that's not part of it?
I didn't see that, but from what I've seen, a lot of the objections just are that the money, what is being placed into the settlement in the amount of money, it's not all actually, they don't know if all the money is going to show up. And some feel that the money is not enough to actually pay for what everything that needs to be done can be done.
And if a state, you know, such as Pennsylvania, in the Conowingo WIP process would say, you know, we have no more blood, you know, from this turnip. How would that play? What would be the outcome of that? Since we have technically the WIP is not a, you know, it belongs to, you know, the 51st state of Conowingo doesn't exist. So if Pennsylvania says we're a turnip and we have no more blood to contribute, what happens then?
So, I mean, a couple thoughts, and also to address some of the comments raised in the chat function. Rick Roush, who's the Dean of Agriculture and was involved with the PA in the balance discussion that I mentioned, right, raised the question of, has there been discussion and research into dredging, and what did that look like? I actually posted in the Q&A function a link to the very extensive work that was looking at dredging. When I think about these questions, right, I've continued to pester a lot of people in a lot of leadership positions and say, well, what about the Conowingo? And they're like, we wait until we see what the WIP looks like. Well, now we have the WIP, right, for the Conowingo. But at the end of the day, if you're going to implement something, you have to implement it somewhere. Pennsylvania's budget is not good. It wasn't good before COVID hit, and it's worse now. That was one of the things that EPA pointed out, was you didn't have the funding, you, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, didn't have the money set aside. What you saw actually this past fall and last year, particularly as COVID really hit, was, can we take funding out of some of those environment? Can we take it out of the conservation districts? Can we take it out of clean and green? Can we take it out of some of those environmental sources? I think there was a lot of pushback of saying, no, we actually need to put more money there, right? Can we, for some of this restoration work? So I can see one of two paths forward. This is just me speaking for me, right? I can see a potential competition for where can we put these practices on the ground, or a potential cooperation. And that cooperation is complicated because of all of these different dynamics that are swirling together in very real time. But Pennsylvania doesn't have enough money. The counties are starting to identify projects that need to get done. When we're out talking with farmers and producers on the ground, they want to know, is what I'm doing making a difference? And some of the research projects I've been involved in have been able to say, yes, it is. It's just not as fast as we want to see it. Penn State College of Ag Sciences did a survey in conjunction with the Commonwealth a few years ago to say, we're only getting credit for best management practices that have a federal cost share, but are there other practices that are also being implemented? And the answer was yes. So a lot of people are doing things, right? So it's a lot of trying to sift and sort out, what are we seeing? How do we implement this? How do we move this forward? The other question that was raised in the chat was, what questions are we seeing related to COVID? Do we have some initial results? The answer is yes. I'm happy to share some of the links in the documentation on that. But very quickly, we're seeing a tremendous, one of the goals from the 2014 agreement, for example, was we want more people to get outdoors. What have we seen with COVID? A lot more people outdoors. Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources a couple times this past year was like, don't go here, please go there. Our outdoor areas are being heavily used. That is also an opportunity, right? We've got more people who are outdoors than we're used to having. How do we capitalize on that?
Right.
There are other impacts as well, financial being a big one.
We have a little bit of leeway because the session, we are going till 3:15. We're just going to bleed into our break a little bit, but I'm okay with doing that. Ross, if you wanted me to make a hard stop here, just tell me. I want to do at least ask one more question, which is with the incoming EPA secretary, with the new administration, what do either of you think we're going to be seeing in terms of differences in approach? Obviously, the last 4 years have been, slightly quiet, and, we have these things that have gone on, such as the word aspirational being used and, and not enforceable being used. What do we think that we're looking at here with the coming administration? And go ahead. Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, so three thoughts. One, when it relates to the larger Clean Water Act as a whole, there's been quite a bit of discussion about the definition of the Clean Water Act in the waters of the United States. Writ large, I see that being revisited again, in part because there was a US Supreme Court decision in May of this year related to basically saying, look, if you can connect groundwater in enough time and distance, it's the Maui case, then that can be regulated. That is a big wild card that has nothing to do with this, but everything to do with this, right? So waters of the United States and jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, going to be revisited. How it's going to be shaped, who knows? Two is you're likely to have an administration coming in and being much more supportive of this kind of work. But three, I think one of the impacts of the last 4 years has every year, the administration has said, we're going to zero out funding for this. And every year they've actually gotten decent or a little bit of an increase in funding. That threat to funding has had a very big impact. I know of several different Chesapeake Bay program staffers who are like, hi, I got offered a job someplace else. I'm taking it because it's more surety that my job will be there. So the program has in a lot of ways held steady, but through a lot of threats of up and down. And I see that evening out a little bit. So potentially more money coming into this space, easier to talk about climate change and climate impacts. But the staff have been working very steadily, even as the folks in Pennsylvania are, right? There's just a huge need for help at the more local level and more coordination to sort out all of the above. Paul,
Any thoughts, Paul?
I would agree with that. I think there's going to be a lot more support, and yeah, you can use the word climate change again.
Well, okay. How about the defense to the actual lawsuit here against the EPA? Obviously, the motion to dismiss is pending. That legal tactic isn't going to change. It's already been filed. But from once that's resolved in whichever way it is, obviously you have new people, formulating the litigation strategy potentially. You see it. Tell us about that, Laura. The actual defense is the motion to dismiss itself. Anything that you can foresee that might become more aggressive or less aggressive, for I guess is actually the way to put it, with regard to the defense against this lawsuit. Do you think the U.S. or the EPA will change its position at all?
Quite potentially, yes. And you saw that with plenty of litigation that happened at the last switch of administration, right? The administration in a number of suits was going one way and then reversed course. And so what you saw was a number of parties intervening to keep the cases on point. Because the delay in when they have to respond to all these motions has now been pushed into the spring. I think if it was all due 2 days ago, you would have seen one set of answers. Pushed into the spring, you're going to see a different set of answers. What they're going to say, I don't know. Again, it's fascinating to me that there's a lot of the target is Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has not intervened, has no attorney involved.
Yeah. The idea that New York has intervened, but Pennsylvania has not. Does anyone have anything to add with regard to trying to digest and understand that decision? Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. I mean, I could see Pennsylvania doing what it did, but that's certainly a risky decision to make.
Yeah, I don't have answers to that, and I've not talked with anybody with the Attorney General's office for PA. And even if I did, I'm not sure they'd tell me per se, hey, what's your litigation strategy here with this? Again, talking with the person who's working and leading this, Jill Whitcomb from the DEP, her focus, I mean, she basically said, look, I'm like a horse on a racetrack. I've got my blinders on. I'm really focused on what we can do to accomplish this at the county action plan level. We know what we're trying to do, and we're trying as hard as we can to get this accomplished. So they've hired coordinators, staff people to help deal with that. And they're hoping for all of those counties to have their county action plans in place by September of this year. But they're hiring those coordinators now, so it's very, very fast time frame. So I think that's where the energy is going, at least from the staff side from DEP. Stay tuned. Again, you know, it's a lame answer, but that's kind of what I could give you.
Okay, perhaps we should go ahead and do a hard stop now. So thanks so much, Laura, and thank you, Paul. Greatly appreciated. Excellent program. Okay, everyone, we gave you your 2 code words. If anyone has an issue with that, you can contact us, and if you missed them in some way, perhaps contact Jackie Schweikler. She's sort of doing a lot of the administrative related to this this symposium. All right, we will be back at 2:15 with our session on pesticide drama and dicamba non-target injury liability. Thank you very much, Laura and Paul. We'll see everybody at 2:15.